Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. My guest on today's show is Mark Olly, a well-respected archaeologist, historian, lecturer, TV personality, and best-selling author. I'll be talking with him about his book, The Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur. Mark Olly, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
It's a pleasure to be back. Nice to see you again.
While I'm sure everyone on the planet has heard about the legends of Merlin, King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table, I don't think as many people know who Joseph of Arimathea is and the meaning of the word Polychronicon. That being the case, could you please tell me what Polychronicon means and who was Joseph of Arimathea?
Polychronicon just means it's a medieval term for a chronological history. As the name suggests, that is literally what this book is. It's in chronological order. And anybody that knows anything about, Merlin and King Arthur and all the knights and that, if you don't put some kind of an order to it, it just descends into chaos. So it's a really easy book to read in that sense. If you want the old stuff, it's at the beginning. If you want the new stuff, it's at the end. It's literally that simple. The last guy to do a Polychronicon, ironically, lived about 20 odd miles down the road from where I am here in the UK. And he was alive in, I think it was the 1330s or the 1340s. And he was the last guy to do one. He did a world history that included Arthur. This is not a world history. This is just Arthur. But he did it to start his millennium, to kind of kick off that millennium. So I'm doing one to start off this millennium. Joseph of Arimathea, interesting character. As soon as I say Holy Grail, the Holy Grail, Joseph is the beginning of that legend. He's the guy that recovers whatever it is that you perceive to be the Holy Grail, which I'm sure we're going to get into in some detail. But he had access to the two primary sources for grails, in inverted commas. One was the Last Supper and the other was the crucifixion. And that generated all of the Christian relics that later on, people like King Arthur and the knights that came after Arthur's knights went off on quests trying to discover. So really, he's the root source of that. So Merlin comes first because he stands on the shoulders of the Druids. So that's the oldest path that's represented in the book. So if you want to understand him, that's where that's coming from. Next in line is the Christian content, because it's undeniable that that's where the Holy Grail's coming from. It's coming from that tradition. So the next one then is Joseph. And then, of course, you've got the man himself, King Arthur. He comes next, hence the chronological order. There you go.
What, Mark, initially attracted you to the subject matter you write about in your book?
You've got to go all the way back to the beginning, really, of my career in production for that, because I started off as literally a film producer on Super 8mm and Standard 8mm film in the 1970s as a precursor to going to art college. So when I was 14, I was with a Cine Society over here, and we produced a half-an-hour movie called King Arthur Seasons of the Mind. And I started doing the research for the scripting of that, the background of that. Fascinating movie. If anybody buys the book, it's in the introduction at the beginning, because it's an obvious place to start, from looking at the book's point of view. It then takes 45 years of me making notes, mucking about with early computer technology. So it started off as written notes and written research. Then it eventually moved on to a BBC. And then I think from there it went to an Amstrad. And then from an Amstrad computer, we had two of those. I think it was an 825, whatever it was, and a 95, whatever. Then it went on to Windows 3.0. And we've actually seen off 7 different machines till eventually handed it over to Philip Mantle at Flying Disc Press, who is the publisher, handed it over to him. And then he angle grinds it into PDF and then sends it on to Amazon. So goodness only knows how many formats that thing's been through before it arrived. But that's really the story of how that was put together. So it's 45 years of research, and goodness knows how many publishers in the past say no, because it's got some really edgy material in it, which is always good for a book.
What methodology did you use, Mark, in your approach to how you went about writing the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur?
Okay, that's an enormously important question. As an archaeologist, I've got this thing which I started when I wrote a book on Robin Hood, and I called it literary archaeology. So where physically you go through layers of time and you try to push whatever you're dealing with back to its furthest point. I basically did the same thing with written and printed sources for things like Robin Hood, the Green Man, the Romans, and ultimately Arthur. I've got that kind of approach. So there are some things that Arthur could have done, given the time period he lived in, and there are some things that he obviously couldn't have done. So in terms of methodology, by the time you get to the Normans, by the time you're getting into fairly serious medieval times, there's an awful lot of baggage that's been bolted onto the early material. The book itself relies on the earlier material. And what I began to discover very, very quickly, very early on, is that actually the true story, the gritty kind of Game of Thrones type story that we're handling there is far more exciting than all this shiny, chivalric knights in shining armour chasing damsels and dragons nonsense that you get sort of later on. In terms of methodology, it's like there are experts in the world, massive amount of respect to them, who deal with that medieval material and they deal with it extremely well. But then there's a lot of people who are not experts that have mucked about with the early stuff and not really given it the sort of credence and the academic attention that it requires. So I have to say, I mean, for the popular side of the book, there's 5 major chapters, 5 major sections in the book. 4 of them you can read as a popular book. And then you're going through it, and presumably the academics will kind of go through it and they'll poo-poo it and they'll say, it's not written in a format that suits us, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden you just barrel into chapter 5, and 5 is your source material. It's an entire chapter just devoted to the development, the literary development of the legend. That makes really interesting reading because you can see how it's pieced together. You can see how the whole thing grows over time. Hence Polychronicon, again, that is a really nice device to apply to a book. I don't think anybody's ever done that, actually, not in the last sort of 800 years. It's quite an exciting development, I suppose, for books in general.
How, Mark, did you go about separating actual truth from myth and legend, and what criteria did you use in deciding what goes in what category?
Well, that's a really good question. I started off with the 5 questions which are at the beginning of the book, which is like, when did he live? Where did he live? What could he possibly have done? What are the oldest sources that we've got? And there's another question as well, I can't remember. But basically looking at what I'd already said in terms of literary archaeology, very, very quickly you start to realise that there are certain things he just could not have done because he's alive either side of 500 AD. So there's only a certain number of things that are there at that point. So if anything, he's late Druidic, early Christian, just coming out of the end of Roman. So we've not even got into Byzantine yet. That's not even happened. You haven't got the Eastern Roman Empire. He's in a very late Roman context. As soon as you get to the medieval legends, you very, very quickly start to see where there's genuine stuff that genuinely fits into the geography, and there are real names that you can trace back into the early sources, and then you start to get the nonsense. You get things that are pulled in from elsewhere, and you get the baggage. Initially, it wasn't too difficult to sort out the wood from the trees. Also, I have to say, before the age of printing, you had to have a credible story. Most of the things that were written or that were printed or were produced were done so for nobles and ultimately royalty. So if you got the story wrong or you got the characters wrong, it just ceased to be believable. There was an absolute core, almost like The Life of Arthur. If somebody had actually written it beforehand, it was like that book sort of influenced everything that came after it. So you couldn't not rely on that story that was the spine of the whole tale. Unfortunately, the bards stuck to it. The early writers, which were mostly Welsh, they stuck to it. When the Vikings and the Danes got hold of the legend, they stuck to it. And so by the time you get to medieval times, up to Geoffrey of Monmouth, he's basically sticking to it, but politically, he's moving things around a bit so that the nonsense begins with Geoffrey. Even in Geoffrey's lifetime in the 1100s, somebody said, this guy just makes a heap of everything and then makes up the bits that are missing. He invents the bits that he doesn't know. So that's when that starts to creep in. So if you kind of draw a line across it and just say, well, just go for your earliest source. But in terms of methodology, that's what I did. And it threw up some real surprises, especially with the geography and place names and people. And there were some real surprises in there.
How did your extensive knowledge of archaeology factor into the information you gathered for the book?
Well, like I say, in terms of what he could do, his arms, his armour, his approach to hill forts, the fact that he was never a king, he was Dux Bellorum, he was Duke of Battles. So you're looking at a regional chieftain with a military role. Chances are the king over him was Melgrin Gwynedd, who was King of Wales at the time. And he was acting under other authorities. Theodosius, one of the Roman emperors, calls him over to the continent. So he's obviously being commanded by higher authorities. He was never a king. And as soon as you start looking at that, and then you start looking at the geography, people make mistakes. Loads and loads of mistakes with the geography because, you've got this thing where they go, well, I've got a map here and it says on the map Arthur was here. And then you've just got to say, well, hang on a minute, there weren't any maps till after the 1700s. Those names, map names, most of them don't exist before about 1700. So if you've got names in the 1600s, that's a miracle. 1500s, 1400s, 1300s, if you've got place names in records, that's incredible. By the time you start doing that, if you have got something that says King Arthur was here, in comes the archaeology, because you can go to a site and you can say, was this site here in 500 AD. One of the classics is the Grail Castle, Dinas Bran, that overlooks Llangollen in Wales. Because you look at that and you go, hang on a minute, is this sucking great big medieval castle there that was built in 1200 and whatever, on foundations of 1000 and something. And it's the nasty Normans. You look at it and you go, hang on a minute, Arthur's been dead 600 years, 700 years by the time that thing was stuck up there. But, and this is the but, it's built inside the enclosure of an Iron Age hill fort, and the Iron Age hill fort was most definitely there at the same time as Arthur. So it could be the place where the Holy Grail was stored. It's plausible. Once you start doing it in those terms, you get some amazing discoveries. All kinds of things pop up. You start finding Roman remains where you didn't think there were any and things like that. So there's a lot of new material in the book as a result of that.
The Polychronicon is a history that stretches from the end of the Greeks to the rise of the Tudors, focusing especially on topics which impact directly on the mythology of Merlin, Joseph of Arimathea, and Arthur. That is quite a time span to cover. How long did it take you to complete the Polychronicon?
It came together almost in sections. So the chapters that you're reading are based largely on notes that came from the beginning. So the bits at the end where it's got all the credits and, it tells you where all the sources are. Obviously, I've got a notebook and I'm adding that. I'm adding them as I get to them. And then I had two separate projects running. I had one where I was looking at the Druids, and then I had another one where I was looking at Arthur. So you got Arthur and Merlin and the rest of the knights. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute. If we've got Merlin as being the last of an old order of Druids, then we need to know about the Druids. Otherwise, you're not going to know who or what Merlin is. You won't understand how he thinks, how he feels, what that title, because it is a title, it's not just a person. I've got at least 6 of them that had that title. You won't be able to get inside his head. You won't know where he's coming from. The more I started doing that, the more I started thinking, well, hang on a minute. Well, in that case, where's Arthur coming from? Because he's a Roman. So you need to know a little bit about the Romans to know where he's coming from. That's when you can't dodge it. It's just a bullet you can't dodge. You've got to have the Greek information. You've got to have what's known about the Druids. You've then got to have something about the Romans, or you're not going to grasp who and what Arthur is. And then you've got to look at Arthur's times as well. So what about the Christian material? Where does that figure in? It's kind of multinational. One of the real big things for me as well is I also study the Templars. I look at the Templars. So I kind of, after Arthur, the section 4, where we start looking at, what on earth happened. When you start looking at that, I finished up in the cross there in the Holy Land, looking at a study that was done in 2012 on Islamic shipping receipts. What on earth has that got to do with King Arthur? But the shipping receipts tell you where and when the cups that were regarded then as the Holy Grail, where and when they were, and how they were transported, and who transported them, and where they ended up. Honestly, it took me everywhere. It had, over 45 years, it just took me everywhere. It's a truly modern book. It has a very modern outlook. It's international. The characters are very modern in their approach and how they are and what they do. The little bit on the back, the blurb on the back, where it describes exactly who Joseph, Merlin and Arthur are. It's very, very modern characters.
Reconstructing the entire supposedly lost history of the Dark Ages from actual source materials written down at the time is a monumental feast. How and where did you find these source materials?
If you go into the world of academia and you start to ask around, you get a bit of a surprise. Everybody seems to know about things like Beowulf, Bede, Roman documentation and all this kind of thing. The Bible, everybody kind of knows these are the big ancient sources that are really popular. But when you start talking about experts in those different fields, they start saying, well, have you had a look at the saints' lives? And you're like, what do you mean saints' lives? What's that got to do with it? So, well, Arthur gets referenced in the lives of the saints written in Welsh. Well, you're at the Aberystwyth, you're in mid Wales, you require assistance then with ancient Welsh. I worked with Scott Lloyd and Steve Blake, who did The Keys to Avalon, which was a book that came out on Element in the 1990s. They realised very quickly that they were experts in the Welsh Arthur, but they didn't realise that Wales actually stretched all the way into England at that point. So they then needed somebody who was doing Arthur over in England. I helped them a great deal with that. So credit where credit's due, there's quite a bit of their Welsh material that's found its way into my material. But then there are documents that have survived. The Dark Ages are not as dark as we think. There are early Viking documents. There are quite a few Anglo-Saxon documents. There's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which actually gives you a time frame. It doesn't mention mention Arthur because the Saxons didn't know who the hell he was and hated him anyway, so why would they? But it gives you a time frame. You can see the development of Saxon Britain through it. And then, the Romans, there's a lot of obscure stuff. There's lots of little tiny references all over the place. The Romans were also in places like France. So the French material, that helps because they're referencing what's going on across the channel in Britain. And again, Druidic sources, all of the Druidic sources come out of Roman material. So as soon as you start poking around, you start to discover there's a lot more out there than you think. And it's a shame because in Victorian times, everybody would have studied the Greeks. You'd have done Greek studies. So where the Romans talk about the Druids being heavily influenced by Pythagoras, you've then got to go off and have a look at Pythagoras. Lo and behold, you find the golden verses. That pretty much tells you exactly what Merlin was. It gives you, if you like, the formula because he's Pythagorean, because he's a Druid. And you've also got to, dig and dig and dig. Nag Hammadi Library, Dead Sea Scrolls, all these different things that are influencing what's going on in the Roman world and through into medieval times. It's a real hodgepodge, it's a Heinz 57 of sources. But there's a shed load of stuff out there. I got a whole chapter out of it. Chapter 5 is basically all the stuff I think that people don't know exists. It's not all about Geoffrey of Monmouth.
The Polychronicon reveals incidents and characters as they really were, listed in chronological order, leaving the impression that Britain has always been a very different place to the one painted by popular history. Did your research uncover who may have been responsible for that and their reasons for doing so?
When you start to look at the foundations of something, you start to answer that amazing question, which is why is it where it is and what did it mean at the beginning? So when the Romans get here, they're pushing to get to the centre of Britain. There's no doubt about that. And at the centre of Britain, according to the Romans, that's where you go if you want to learn Druidry, because the centre of Britain has a more powerful Druid tradition than anywhere else in the world, including Gaul, which is France. So they're heading up here because they know if they can subdue the Druids, they can sort the whole of the Celtic problem out because they've got a problem with the Celts. When they get up here, they also discover, lo and behold, it's the place the Christians also have started because Joseph of Arimathea, when he comes over here, he comes to North Wales. So the first Christians and the last of the Druids are in the same place. Lo and behold, where do they decide to put the capital city? They stick it in Chester. Now, at this point, you've got to remember, London doesn't exist. It's not even really been founded as a proper fortress. Chester's immense. It's absolutely immense. It's got enormous walls. It's 11 acres bigger than any other fort they ever built anywhere in the world. It's got unique buildings. The amphitheatre's bigger than it should be. The bathhouse is bigger than it should be. The Roman Principia, the command building's bigger than it should be. And it's got this elliptical building in it, which would have been known as Tabliarum Rotundus, the round floor. By the time you start looking at that, you realise that the first Christian martyrs were with the amphitheatre. The baths turned into a Dark Age palace. You start looking at all this, you think, hang on a minute, Camelot. I'm not out of order saying that because that's exactly what the Welsh said. And if you go all the way up to the famous book Le Morte d'Arthur, that's what Le Morte d'Arthur says. It's in Wales, it's in Wallace, which is where Chester is. It's right on that edge, but it's bang in the centre of Britain. Now you start seeing the bigger picture because you've got Rome in the middle, and if you go to the Western Roman Empire, you've got Chester, and if you go to the Eastern Roman Empire, you've got Constantinople, which is Istanbul. And guess what? Those two cities are roughly the same distance away from Rome. They're also both imaginary copies, if you like, of Rome, so they have things in common. So once you start to get into that, you begin to think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe London isn't the capital of Britain after all. The truth of the matter is, it's not. It didn't come to prominence, really, till early medieval times with the Vikings. First of all, it was Chester, then it was Winchester with the Saxons, then the Vikings decided they were going to go for London. What it's developed into now is a modern phenomena. Originally, it was all about Chester. So that's just one example when you start looking at these things, just how it changes the geography. Emperors coming from Britain, the very first Pope, Linnaeus, that's on the Pope list, his mum is British. The first church founded in the entire world. You can go knock on the Pope's door and ask him and say, what's the oldest church? He won't say the Church of Rome. He'll say the British Celtic Church, because we're 52 to 54 AD. The Roman Church is 60, 62, 64 AD. We're Joseph of Arimathea, they're Peter and Paul. There's a lot of things that you read the book very quietly as you start going through the book. You start to think, hang on a minute, wow. And there's lots of these little moments where the light bulb comes on and you go, oh, hang on a minute, it's not as history portrayed it to be. There's a little bit more going on here than we think.
If one wants to know the truth about Arthur, the Holy Grail, Camelot, Excalibur, the Round Table, heroic knights, and Guinevere, they'll find the answers in the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur. Should viewers of Paranormal Yakka want to buy it and also learn about your other books, how can they do it?
All the books I've ever written, everything, they're all on Amazon. Just head for Amazon. They're all exactly as they're written, except the Robin Hood one, because I spelt it differently. It's ROBYNHOODE. So if you go for that one, you have to spell it differently to get it. But put my name in, they're all in Amazon. You know, pay the money, click, and a couple of days later, it comes whizzing through your door. Wonders of modern technology. I have to say that the hardback is so nice. It's such a good book. So if you're going to buy it as a gift, as a birthday present, go for the hardback. It's worth the extra few quid, the extra few dollars, just to get it in hardback. It's a glorious thing. But I'm not fussy, just go and buy it.
Mark Olly, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakka. It's always a pleasure yakking with you.
And a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakka. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.